Hi, good afternoon. I'm sorry that I cannot be in this very interesting conference, and thank you for inviting me to attend and to participate. I'm going to talk today about rethinking brain and gender beyond the binary. And before going beyond the binary, let's start with the binary. So within the sex binary framework, the taken for granted starting point is that there are male and female brains. Within this framework, the research method is to look for sex differences, and when these are found, they are taken as evidence that indeed there are male and female brains. And we can see this, or how this self-maintaining belief system works, in a very famous study in which the researchers assessed the strengths of over 9,000 connections in the human brain. And they found differences in several dozens. Now, it will not surprise you to learn that the title of this study or of this paper wasn't that the brains of men and women are very, very similar. Instead, they focused on the relatively few differences. But let's go with them and focus on the differences. And what this summary diagram shows, it depicts all the connections that were stronger on average in men compared to women in the upper panel, and all the connections that were stronger on average in women compared to men in the lower panel. The color code is blue for intrahemispheric connections and orange for interhemispheric connections. And when you look at these images, it seems that we are from Mars and Venus, so we don't even belong to the same planet. And it's a wonder how men with a blue brain and women with an orange brain can even talk to one another. And indeed, the way they speak about these human brains, male brains and female brains, is as if they belong to two groups. Male brains are structured this way and female brains are structured another way. And what they assume is that what is typical to the brains of men is to have male typical connections. And what's typical to the brains of women is to have female typical connections. Now, at first, this sounds very logical. This is a logic that we are very familiar with from the genitalia. In the genitalia, indeed, what is typical of women or females is to have female typical genital organs. And what is typical of males is to have male typical genital organs. The reason to suspect that this is not the case when we talk about the brain is that there are many types of evidence or studies showing that what is typical of the brains of females and males may be different under different conditions. And because this is such a huge difference between sex effects on the brain and sex effects on genitalia, I want to focus on this for a minute, looking at a single study. This study has been done on rats, and in this study, they looked on dendritic spines. So just a very quick course in neuroscience. So what we see here is a piece of dendrite, which is a part of the neuron. And you can see the small extensions from this dendrite, and these are called the dendritic spines. And you can easily see the difference between the spines in males and females. So they are much denser in females compared to males. So this is an example of a sex difference in the brain. There was another group of rats in this study, and these rats underwent 30 minutes of stress one day before their brains were assessed. And again, we see a sex difference, but it is reversed. What was typical of males without stress, that is low spine density, we now see in the stressed females. And what was typical of females, we now see in the stressed males. And I can't see you, obviously, but if you are not amused enough, imagine what you would think and feel if I told you that 30 minutes of stress are enough to change your penis into a clitoris or your clitoris into a penis. Now, I hope you are laughing now. And the reason that you may be laughing is because this never happens with our genital organs. They never change from one type to the other. But this happens a lot in the brain. And there are many studies like the one I showed you showing these types of reversal of sex differences in many regions of the brain, in many features of the brain, things that we can measure, and following many different manipulations. Even housing rats, one to a cage or several to a cage, is enough to reverse some sex differences in the cortex. And when you look at all of these studies together, what you realize is that these interactions between sex and other factors like stress or housing conditions may be different for different brain measures. So the same manipulation that may reverse a sex difference in one brain measure, for example, here you can see that the difference in here, it's a cannabinoid receptors. So the difference between males and female without stress is reversed following stress. So the same stress that reversed the sex difference here may have a different effect in another region of the hippocampus. In here, it abolishes the difference. So we had a sex difference before stress, but following stress, there is no longer a stress difference. And when we look at all of these studies together, we can learn several things. So the first is that there are sex differences in the brain, well, at least in the rat brain, because all of these studies have been done in rats, but I will show you later that there are also sex differences in the human brain. This also means that sex-related variables affect the brain. So some things that are related to sex, it could be sex-related hormones, it could be sex-related chromosomes, it could be other sex-related factors, they affect the brain. And indeed, from other types of studies, not these type of studies, but from other types of studies in which these are manipulated, we know that especially sex-related hormones have many effects on brain structure and function. But what these studies also show is that these effects of sex-related factors interact with other variables, so that what is typical of males and females in the brain may be opposite under different conditions. And this challenges the sex binary, and specifically the assumption that what is typical of the brains of males is to have male typical features, and what's typical of the brains of females is to have female typical features. And this is because even if I assume that at some specific point, let's say now, my entire brain is in the female typical form, then following one of these many events, some of my brain features will change their form, others will not, and I will end up with a mosaic brain. Mosaic, a combination, unique combination of both female typical and male typical features. So this has been this is the mosaic hypothesis, which I formulated over a decade ago. And a few years later, I managed to test this hypothesis in the human brain. Together with Professor Yaniv Asaf and a group of students, we analyzed the structure of over 1,400 human brains. And we did many different analyses of MRI images and analyzed everything that you can derive from these images. I'm going to show you only one analysis. In this one, we divided each brain into 116 regions, measured the volume of each region in each brain, and wrote it down in a table. In this table, each line represents a single brain, the 116 measures of volumes. Then we use a color code to visualize similarities and differences between the brains of men and women. So for each region, if this region was relatively large compared to the volume of this region in all other brains, men and women combined, then we colored it in green. And if it was relatively small, we colored it in yellow. And when we were done, this is what we saw. Brains of men on the left, brains of women on the right. Each line, a single brain. Now, you don't need statistics to see that there are differences between the brains of men and women. At the group level, there is more green at the women's side and more yellow at the men's side. But you could also see that there are that brains are rarely all green or all yellow. Instead, each brain is a unique combination. No two lines here are the same, of green, which is more common in women, and yellow, which is more common in men. So I want to stress that the question is not whether there are sex-gender differences in the human brain. You can see that there are, others have shown differences that are much smaller than the differences that we see in rats, but still there are differences in the human brain. Also, I'm not interested in the source of these differences, the nature versus nurture debate, but only in whether these differences add up consistently within each brain to create two types of brains, female brains and male brains, as is often assumed to be the case, or do these differences mix up, if you want, in each brain to create these mosaic brains? And I think that when you look at these images, the answer is clear. Brains are mostly composed of mosaics of both female typical and male typical features. In fact, when I look at these images, it seems to me that not only that we do not belong into two population of brains, male brains and female brains, but rather that we all belong into a single, highly heterogeneous population of human brains, in which what is typical of both males and females is to have these unique mosaics. And in another set of studies, which I don't have time to describe, but has been published, so you're welcome to read the paper, we analyze the structure of several thousands human brains using many different techniques. And I'm only going to show you the conclusions. So the conclusion was that indeed the brain architectures that are typical of women are also typical of men and vice versa, and that sex category provides little information on brain structure. In other words, knowing that I am female, for example, doesn't allow you to predict my brain structure, nor does it allow you to predict or my brain structure is as likely to be similar to the brain of any woman in the audience as of any man in the audience. And you can get this general principle also if you go back and look, or we can do this together, look at the figure that we started this talk with. So you can see here that even though clearly sex affects the density of dendritic spine, so there is a sex difference both in the no stress and in the stress condition, knowing the sex category of an animal, so for example, knowing that an animal is male, does not allow you to predict whether this animal will have low or high density of spines. And this is not because sex does not affect this brain feature, but rather because sex effects interact with other factors, in this example, with stress, to determine the form of each brain region or of most brain regions. So if there are no male brains and female brains, what about men and women? Are there men and women? So let's look for a few minutes on gender. And gender is a term that is used both at the individual level as a system, social system that divides power and status between men and women as gender identity. Here I'm also only going to talk about gender as a femininity and masculinity, or as psychological characteristics that show differences between men and women. So we know that there are such differences in humans, in cognition, personality, behavior, certain behaviors, interests, etc. These differences in some domains are much smaller than people tend to believe, but still there are differences. I'm again not interested in the source of these differences, the environment, or we are born this way, but only if they add up to create two types of humans, women and men. And we conducted a very similar analysis, it was published in the same paper, and we looked at the behaviors, attitudes, preferences, cognitive abilities, etc., of several thousands of humans, and in several data sets. And in each data set, we chose a few variables that showed the largest differences between men and women in that sample. So, for example, here in this MADIX is a representative American sample. We chose several variables. And for each of these variables, we colored, again, as we did before, so but this time a blue, pink color code. So we colored a cell in pink if it was in the feminine side, so more common in women than in men, or blue if it was on the masculine side. And just to give an example, so for example, if someone was really worried about their weight, then they were colored in pink, because in that sample, as in many other samples, women on average cared more about their weight than men did. And similarly, if someone had very high self-esteem, then we colored it in blue, because in that sample, and again, in many other samples, men on average have higher self-esteem than women. So when we were done, this is what we saw. So again, each line here represents this time a single person, but only 7 characteristics, not 116, as we saw before. And these are men, these are women. There were just simply more women than men in the sample. And again, you can easily see the group level differences. As at the group level, there is more blue at the men's side and more pink at the women's side. Also, what you can see is that there is quite a lot of pink in the blue and quite a lot of blue in the pink. And this is known. So for any known psychological variable, there is some overlap between men and women. So some men are feminine and some women are masculine in each or every trait. But what we were interested in is whether there are blue and pink people. And in this sample, there was no one that had only blue variables or only pink variables. Instead, most people had both pink, so they were highly feminine on some variables and highly masculine on others. And we've recently launched a website in which you can answer a set of questions about many variables that often show large differences between men and women. And once you finish to fill out the questionnaire, you get your own mosaic. So we show you how feminine, masculine, or gender neutral you are in each trait. And this is, for example, my mosaic when my scores are compared to a sample from the United States. And of course, when you compare my same answers, so my answers don't change. When I compare my answers to a sample from another country, Japan or Israel, then obviously my mosaic changes, because what is typical of males and females or of men and women in different cultures obviously differs. So you can fill the questionnaire once, see your mosaic, and then play with it and see how your mosaic changes when you compare yourself to people around the world. And obviously, I'm not the only person that is mosaic. So many people have already done the questionnaire, and you can see here many, many different mosaics. And the last thing I want to point out before I end this talk is that a very interesting question for me is, if everyone is mosaic, why when we look around at people, we perceive them as if they belong to two kinds, to men and women? So look around you and you see men and women. You don't see these unique mosaics all around you. Instead, you see people as belonging to two kinds or two types. And there is an answer to this, and we've published a paper talking about this in more detail. But here I'm only going to say one sentence. So the reason we see people as if they belong to two kinds is because the gender binary is a central part of human culture. And we label people as belonging to one of these groups. We sort the environment according to this. We have many biases that lead us to perceive people as if they belong to two types. And the myth of the male and female brain plays a central role in maintaining this self-maintaining belief system. So we started, if you remember, we started with showing how the gender binary framework or the sex binary framework leads science to only see this possibility. And then this is a self-asserting or self-promoting belief within science. And similarly, the gender binary is a self-maintaining belief within society. So I want to thank you very much. And you're welcome to write me, and this is a website for doing your mosaic, and have a great conference. Thank you very much.